Hello, thanks for joining us today. I'm Danny Gomez, Managing Director of Financial and Emerging Markets for FreightWaves. I'm joined today by Dan Scarbrough, the co-founder, president, and chief operating officer of Incubex, a leader in the environmental commodities markets. Thanks for joining us today, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Danny, and thank you to FreightWaves for having us involved today. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so today, what I would love to do is, as you and I have been in contact over the years that we've worked together, we've seen really a shift in, I think more recently, in what is referred to as ESG initiatives. FreightWaves is in a unique position to be providing information and data to the market on really what their environmental impact is from the transportation space. And this is really important. I think in 2018, there was a study that said that transportation made up 26% of the carbon emissions. I think in the US, the passenger and transportation industry is 28% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is a very important topic for the industry, and one that I think we'll continue to dive into. And so we appreciate you coming here today to talk about it. If you don't mind, giving a little bit of a background on your experience in the space. You've been dealing in the environmental markets for quite some time. So just kind of give us some background on how it all got started and where we're at today.
Yeah, sure, Danny. Appreciate that. Incubex is an incubator for exchange-traded products focused on the global environmental space. We entered into a partnership with the European Energy Exchange Group and EEX and Nodal Exchange here in North America to really list a broad range of carbon, renewable energy, renewable fuels contracts back in 2017. Prior to that, my career and also many of my colleagues at Incubex came from a company called Climate Exchange. And Climate Exchange was effectively the first exchange to list carbon futures contracts and many other environmental contracts. And so Climate Exchange was acquired by ICE in 2010 and worked at Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, from 2010 to 2014. And we formed Incubex really on the basis that, we really saw the environmental markets, as a big opportunity, first and foremost, and an area of passion that we had. For myself, starting my career under Dr. Richard Sandor, who really, was named, I think, Time Magazine Father of Carbon Trading, starting with Richard about 15 years ago now, was able to list and work on a lot of these first exchange-traded environmental contracts. So, it's been a great space to be in, and certainly one that, is growing in prominence now.
How is that? What did the environmental market look like from just a carbon perspective 15 years ago?
Yeah, so, Chicago Climate Exchange was a voluntary greenhouse gas program where companies could take a voluntary but legally binding reduction commitment of their greenhouse gas emissions really ahead of any kind of mandate. And so, at the peak of the program, it grew to, over 450 members, companies like Motorola, International Paper, IBM, about 20 of the largest utility companies in North America. And, these companies were taking these reduction commitments on a voluntary basis. On a parallel path, we saw many mandatory market-based solutions, which, really started with the acid rain program under the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, and listing the first futures contract for environmental credits in 2004 was the sulfur dioxide futures contract. And really from there, as we've seen really a proliferation of market-based solutions for environmental markets, the contract set has grown from there. So, we started with SO2, we started with a voluntary greenhouse gas program, and now obviously that's grown in scale. You've got the European Union with an emission trading scheme that has been operating since 2005. You have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in North America, which now is 11 states, most recently your home state, Danny, of Virginia. joining that program, and the Western Climate Initiative with California and Quebec really linking up and being a mandatory carbon program that is cross-border between Canada and the United States. So between that, 29 states and DC having renewable portfolio standards for renewable electricity, and then moving into many of the renewable fuels markets under the renewable fuel standard on a federal level, and many of these states now implementing low carbon fuel standard markets, California, Oregon, a Northeast initiative called the Transportation Climate Initiative, and most recently Minnesota considering legislation for a low carbon fuel standard as well.
So you have this, it sounds like a voluntary market to start, and you're having more mandatory programs being put in place that are, putting pressure on the companies to put in place some ESG standards, if we wanted to label it as that. Just pausing there for a second, I appreciate that everyone who's tuning in may not be as familiar with these markets as you are. What does ESG mean, and how does, I think for us today, focusing on the E part of that acronym?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, I think, we've seen really a mixture of public and private commitments towards sustainability and environmental issues, and, serve on the board of something called the Environmental Markets Association since 2012. And really it's a market-based organization, an industry trade group for market-based solutions to environmental issues. And so, really trying to be a strong advocate for, using market-based solutions to address many of these issues, which, started with acid rain, obviously the reduction of carbon under many of these cap and trade programs, or greenhouse gases under these carbon programs. And most recently, these low carbon fuel standard markets are really aimed at the transportation sector and to promote lower carbon intensity in transportation fuels. And so, we've seen programs in California, as I mentioned, Oregon being considered, in Washington State being considered, in many other states, New Mexico, the Northeast as well. So, really, I think what we've seen from an environmental perspective are a proliferation of these market-based approaches to various environmental issues. And then separate and apart from that, voluntary commitments from corporates as well. So, I think, 10 years ago, it was more about, making that environmentally conscious decision, whether it be, for marketing purposes or, based on, a strong belief in sort of, protecting the environment, and that being a high priority for many of these companies. Now it's more of an investment decision as well, and the capital markets are really, really starting now to value in ESG and the environmental impact of these companies. And so, I think from an investment perspective, many of these companies now are also doing these things based on the fact that, that's what investors are asking for.
As you describe the market, it sounds like there is some states that have standards, some states that don't have standards. There's voluntary, there's things that you can do on your own. How do firms, so, let's just break it down, right? So a company decides to put in some ESG initiatives and some ESG targets. Explain a little bit about what that means from the environmental side, right? What are you committing to do? How do you go about thinking about your carbon footprint? And then what are the ways that what are the tools that firms have at their disposal today to really show those efforts in reduction? I think part of it too, for me, is right, there's the mandatory or the regulation that says that you must do it. There's, if you're a company that has set its own ESG targets, the things that you're choosing to do on your own. But at the end of the day, you do have to be able to measure these activities, the reduction efforts that you're doing, and then the other tools, as you mentioned, the markets that are available for you to go and to purchase offsets to offset the emissions that you're doing. And so explain a little bit about kind of that dynamic from start where you decide to set ESG standards for yourself, then what can you do from an operations perspective, and then what are also the market-based tools available to these companies to show that reduction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What we've seen is a space that really continues to evolve over the last 10, 15 years, and where the market's at now. Certainly, you pick up a newspaper every day. There's a new commitment towards net zero. It seems that every company's sort of looking to bring that target forward. So companies will say, well, we're net zero by 2050. Move it forward. We want to be net zero by 2040. We want to be 100% renewable. Use 100% renewable energy. By 2030. We want to be effectively 24/7 renewable around the clock. All these things have different, connotations. Everyone is looking at different time horizons to achieve, these targets. The ways in which they can do that, can obviously be through direct reduction of their emissions through technology. Depending on the industry, that's going to vary what's available, and potentially based on the market signal and the market price, what may be developed in the way of technology. And that's a big reason why these markets exist, to kind of to put that price signal out there. And so many people who study these markets and analysts are looking at what those price signals are. You can obviously point to some of the mandatory programs. Where European carbon is trading, at all-time highs, going back to, 2005. Look at the California Cap and Trade Program or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But really in the way of, looking at ways to mitigate or offset, some of these things are very straightforward and have been done for years. So, things like Green E certified RECs, have been a tool, for corporates to really go out and use these RECs to offset their electricity usage and make it green. And so RECs are certified, issued by state bodies in many cases, or ERCOT in Texas, PJM, Emirates in the Midwest, WEC out west. And so many of these RECs are measured, verified, generation of renewable energy that can be retired and used in some of these green power purchasing programs. In the case of offsets, there are carbon offsets as well, which some of which are mandatory programs. Like California has a mandatory offset program. They have protocols that they accept as being eligible for compliance. They put limitations normally on the offset usage, so that you have to have an actual direct emissions cut in your footprint, but you can offset some of that. But really, what I think we're starting to see now is, a push for more standardization, more harmonization of some of these voluntary offset standards. You have, many registries out there, the Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry. There's several different registries out there. They all have different technologies and methodologies that they use, many of which have been around for quite some time, that are proven and trusted, but really trying to bring some standardization, some harmonization to what those standards look like, how you track them, how you verify them, what the invalidation risk might be. There's all kinds of moving parts there. So for the voluntary aspect, and we do think that, the voluntary markets are going to be an important piece alongside, many of these mandatory, whether it be state or international, environmental markets that, already exist or certainly could develop down the pipeline. The voluntary market will be a complement, to those, but the voluntary market also needs, to evolve and to scale. And so, there's a task force right now led by Mark Carney that is really aimed at doing that, and many industry stakeholders are involved in that process.
And so in that, if there's a a market in a voluntary market where companies can go and certify pathways. Is that the right terminology?
It could be in the case of fuels. Pathways are kind of the low carbon fuel standards are a good example of that, where you're looking at a carbon intensity level in the transportation fuel, and really, if it's an ethanol plant or biodiesel or some of the various renewable fuel sources out there, you certify these pathways that can demonstrate a lower carbon intensity. And relative to the benchmark in that carbon intensity in the pathway that you've certified, you can generate credits. If you're a company that exceeds the baseline, you have deficits. And so that's kind of the way those programs work.
And so for the programs, whether they're voluntary or state-run, the minting of credits as a process, maybe not getting too deep into that because I'm sure we could spend many hours discussing that process, but in the transportation space, if you were to assess, hey, I've got, this is my carbon footprint for the transportation part of my business. There's, as you said, there's some technologies maybe that I can adopt to reduce and get me closer to net zero. But surely not in the near term. Many companies will be able to do that all through technology, right? There's going to need to be some sort of purchasing, I believe, right, of carbon credits to offset part of the business that whether it's either too costly to do it today or the technology's not there, it's not scalable, but there is this market, and that is, I think, the purpose of these markets to provide a place for people to purchase the credits to offset the business they're doing, and then maybe explain a little bit, how a company would go about interfacing with that market, accessing that market, getting, knowing that they're using a trusted source, right? And then also, a thing that I often see is planting trees, right? As a program that people point to that allows them to say that they're reducing their carbon footprint as well. And so, how does that fit into the market, the offset market, and what's good advice for people as they start going out into the world? One, setting targets for themselves. I think FreightWaves can be a good place to start to get people familiar with what their footprint is. But then there is that part of, okay, now I can understand what my impact is. Now what's the thought process behind reducing it? What are really the tools out there for me to use? Either through, you talked about LCFS. We could, there's EV out there that will happen over time. But as aside from those technologies, from the market's perspective, what are the available markets out there for people to tap into?
Yeah, it's right now, I think one of the key areas for development that will continue to evolve, and many companies have stepped in, is carbon accounting. And how do you account for your carbon footprint? How do you measure it? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, and really putting a finer point on measuring your carbon footprint. And so, depending on what type of emissions you're pointed at, there are various tools out there. And so,
can you pause right there for a second and just describe Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 at a high level?
Yeah, so effectively, you're looking at direct emissions. Something like a refinery, direct emissions at the refinery level, at the power plant level. As you get into Scope 2, you're looking at the electricity usage of those firms. So to run the refinery, you obviously need to, it's a big consumer of electricity. And so as you get into Scope 3, it's more, what are the downstream emission impacts of the products that you're selling? And so, the Scope 2 is, something that, looking at electricity consumption historically, there's been, a long-standing REC market, renewable energy certificate market, where renewable sources like wind, solar, biomass, other qualifying renewable energy sources, generate a REC. And for companies that are buying power, some of that power may be brown, some may be green, but if they want to make sure that the power that they're buying is 100% renewable, one tool that they have are buying RECs, and they can do that to green up the power purchasing that they have. And so really these offsetting tools are not always about carbon offsets. In some cases they can be, of course, but really the type of emissions that you're pointing to, there can be various tools out there, but that's where really the market will evolve. The carbon accounting itself, should become more of a standard. You need more harmonization. You need more transparency. We've always been a big proponent of regulation, and when these markets become futures markets, having the Commodity Futures Trading Commission overseeing the markets, bringing a level of transparency and regulation that really is industry standard to other commodity markets is definitely an important piece of it as well. And so, I think from an investor confidence perspective, from a visibility perspective, the markets need to be transparent. They need to be regulated. You need to have harmonized standards and very rigorous verification.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. I think, one of the things that take away for me is, one, that ESG is here to stay. It sounds like that this is going to be a growing part of really all markets globally, that it's early days still, and there's a lot of coordination to be done across the market. I've been close with ThinkEVX for a while, so we appreciate all the things that you've been able to do there to help bring awareness and transparency. We're excited about the things that FreightWaves can do in the space too, and to start bringing more awareness in the transportation space, and how can we be a place that's creating that transparency and harmonization. So, I think hopefully we can have you back on more chats in the future. I think there's many more areas for us to dive into. But again, thank you so much for your time today. And, for people who want to be connected with ThinkEVX, we'll have contact details for you as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Danny. I appreciate it. And I really enjoyed the conversation. And the transportation sector really is the next evolution, I think, of many of these environmental markets, and something that'll be very front and center for both the consumer side and also the supply side of it. And would be happy to join you again. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.